Rachel Carter hadn't planned on speaking that night. The college reunion dinner was supposed to be about laughter, shared memories, and a little harmless nostalgia. But as she sat there, surrounded by familiar faces and old friends, she couldn't ignore the pull of Ethan Lawson's presence. He had always been the center of every room, the kind of man people gravitated toward, confident, charismatic, with a smile that made you believe he could conquer the world. For years, Rachel had carried her feelings in silence, convincing herself they would fade. But seeing him again, seeing how easily he joked with others, how naturally he commanded attention, brought it all back in a flood. So, when the conversation drifted to old crushes and hidden truths, Rachel surprised even herself by admitting it, that she had always cared for Ethan more than she ever dared to show. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, a hesitation, maybe even warmth. But then his laugh, sharp and dismissive, cut her open. "Rachel, you're sweet," he said, shaking his head. "But you're not the kind of woman I could ever want." The words dropped like a stone in the middle of the table, silencing the group. A few friends shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down at their plates, while others gave Ethan awkward smiles, trying to ease the tension. Rachel felt every eye on her, humiliation flooding her chest until it was hard to breathe. Rachel's cheeks burned, her throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted to laugh it off, to play the rejection as though it hadn't cut so deeply, but her voice wouldn't come. Every second stretched unbearably, the weight of Ethan's dismissal pressing harder as their friends tried to resume the conversation, their voices too loud, too forced, betraying their discomfort. She forced a smile, brittle, trembling, and excused herself from the table, mumbling something about needing fresh air. As she walked away, her heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst through her chest. The humiliation wasn't just in his rejection. It was in the public nature of it, in the way her vulnerability had been laid bare for everyone to see. The girl who had always been quiet, cautious, who rarely risked being noticed, had dared to speak her truth, only to be reminded in front of everyone that she was forgettable, unwanted. Outside the restaurant's warm glow, the cool night air hit her like a slap. She leaned against the brick wall, pressing her palms into her eyes, willing the tears not to fall. She thought of leaving altogether, of calling a cab and disappearing before anyone could follow. Inside, laughter rose again, muffled but sharp in her ears, as though the world had already moved on. For Rachel, though, the moment carved itself into memory, a wound too raw to ignore. And she knew, without doubt, that she could never look at Ethan Lawson the same way again. But then, as Rachel gathered herself outside, a sound cut through the din, a sudden crash, the unmistakable clatter of glass shattering. She froze, turning back toward the restaurant windows just as movement inside turned chaotic. People were standing, chairs scraping across the floor, voices rising in alarm. Her first thought was that some argument had broken out, but then she saw Ethan. Ethan, who had moments ago dismissed her as though she were invisible, crumpled on the floor. His tall frame lay twisted unnaturally, his face pale and slack as their friends rushed around him. Someone shouted his name. Another yelled for an ambulance. The scene blurred in Rachel's eyes, her own heartbreak momentarily eclipsed by a sharp jolt of disbelief. She pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection merging with the chaos inside, as if fate itself had chosen this moment to tear the ground out from under both of them. Ethan Lawson, the man who had seemed untouchable in every way, too confident, too ambitious, too certain of himself to ever falter, was suddenly fragile, human, and terrifyingly mortal. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders. She didn't know why, but something deep in her chest told her that this collapse, this cruel twist of timing, was not an ending but the beginning of something neither of them could have foreseen. And despite everything, despite her shame and her anger, Rachel felt her feet move toward the door. Rachel Carter was used to blending into the background. Even as a child, she had learned how to occupy space without demanding it, how to offer without expecting much in return. Her mother used to call her the helper, the one who quietly tidied up after her siblings, the one who soothed arguments before they escalated, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries when everyone else forgot. At school, she had been the girl people confided in, the friend who listened intently and held their secrets like fragile glass, but never the one they chose when invitations were scarce or partners were picked. It was never cruelty, not exactly. It was more the persistent indifference of people who assumed Rachel would always be there. And for years, she was that by the time she entered nursing school, Rachel had perfected the art of being indispensable without being visible. Her professors admired her diligence, her patients adored her patience, and her colleagues trusted her instincts. She had a gift for recognizing the small details, the way a child clutched a stuffed animal a little too tightly, the tremor in an elderly patient's hand that others dismissed. Yet in meetings, it was her louder classmates who won praise. In family gatherings, it was her siblings who earned the spotlight, one brother off to Wall Street, her sister pursuing a PhD. Rachel, despite working 16-hour hospital shifts and surviving the relentless grind of residency, was simply the nurse. A good daughter, yes. A kind soul, yes. But rarely, if ever, remarkable in anyone's eyes. That was the unspoken narrative. Rachel was steady, reliable, and invisible. Ethan Lawson, on the other hand, had never once blended into the background. He had been the boy teachers praised, the athlete who turned heads, the young man who always seemed destined for something greater. Even as a teenager, he carried himself with a swagger that suggested the world existed to meet him halfway. He was bright, articulate, and ruthless in his ambition. Where Rachel had learned to make herself smaller, Ethan had mastered the art of taking up space. He didn't wait for opportunities to come. He created them, or he pushed others aside until the path cleared. After law school, he secured a coveted position at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. By his late 20s, Ethan had carved a reputation as a lawyer who could talk his way through anything. Contracts, boardrooms, negotiations dripping with billions of dollars at stake. He thrived on pressure, on the spectacle of winning, on the intoxicating mixture of risk and reward. His charm disarmed colleagues. His arrogance made rivals grind their teeth. And yet, beneath the polished exterior, Ethan was fraying. The hours were punishing, the expectations impossible. He lived on caffeine, skipped meals, drowned stress with whiskey at networking events. He brushed off the headaches, the dizzy spells, the racing heartbeat that woke him in the middle of the night. To admit weakness, even to himself, was unthinkable. Ethan Lawson was built on the image of strength, of victory, of invincibility. That image had no cracks, at least none he would allow others to. See, Rachel and Ethan's lives had once run side by side. They had grown up on the same suburban street, played on the same cracked basketball courts in the summers, biked to the same corner store for popsicles. Rachel had been the quiet shadow trailing after Ethan and his friends, tolerated because she never demanded too much attention, always willing to go along with their plans. Ethan, older by 2 years, never noticed the way her eyes followed him, the way she memorized his laugh, the way she treasured every scrap of kindness he tossed her way. To him, Rachel was the dependable neighbor, the little sister type, someone safe to confide in when he didn't want to look vulnerable to anyone else. He told her about his dreams of being a lawyer, about how he would escape their small town and build a life where his name meant something. Rachel listened, absorbed every word, and quietly built her own dreams around his orbit. But as they grew, the distance widened. Ethan left for college with a scholarship and swagger, while Rachel stayed closer to home, balancing nursing classes with part-time jobs to keep herself afloat. When their paths crossed, during holidays, hometown visits, the occasional mutual gathering, Ethan would greet her warmly, sometimes even affectionately, but always with a hint of that same blind spot. She was still the safe listener, the girl next door who was always there but never truly seen. And Rachel, for all her quiet strength, never shook the feeling that she had been left behind. Now, at 26, Rachel found herself standing on the cusp of change she could barely articulate. She was nearing the end of her residency, one grueling year away from officially stepping into the career she had fought so hard to build. Her shifts were long, her body perpetually tired, but there was pride in her work, pride in knowing she was shaping herself into something formidable. Yet privately, Rachel felt the familiar ache, the invisibility, the sense of being everyone's comfort but no one's choice. When she looked back at her relationships, there was a pattern she couldn't ignore. Men who admired her kindness but never saw her as a partner. Friends who leaned on her empathy but rarely reciprocated. Even her family, though they loved her, unconsciously treated her as the reliable fallback, the one they didn't need to worry about. The night of the reunion dinner wasn't just about Ethan's rejection. It was about everything Rachel had carried for years. The confession she made, that vulnerable leap, had been more than a declaration of love. It was a test of whether she could finally be seen. His response, cruel, dismissive, and public, shattered something inside her. But it also lit a spark, one she hadn't expected. For the first time in her life, Rachel didn't just want to endure invisibility. She wanted to break it. Ethan, for all his outward success, was living in denial. The law firm celebrated him as one of their youngest rising stars. Clients sought him out for his ability to spin gold out of chaos, and his bank account reflected the life he had always imagined. But lately, every win felt emptier. The nights stretched longer, the parties more hollow, the victories less satisfying. And the health problems he ignored were becoming harder to brush off. He told himself the dizziness was nothing, the fatigue just part of the job, the shortness of breath a fluke. But deep down, a part of him knew something wasn't right. Still, admitting it would mean admitting weakness. And Ethan Lawson could never be weak. When he saw Rachel again at the reunion dinner, something stirred in him, though he didn't recognize it for what it was. She wasn't the little neighbor girl anymore. She carried herself differently now, not loud, not flashy, but steady, self-assured in a quiet way that unsettled him. For a moment, Ethan almost let himself soften, almost let himself see her. But pride was a cruel master. When she confessed her feelings, his instinct wasn't kindness. It was to reject, to protect his image, to laugh it off so no one would think less of him. He didn't realize until too late that the words he chose cut her deeper than he intended. He didn't realize that in dismissing her, he was also dismissing the very anchor he might need when his own carefully constructed world began to fall apart. Ethan Lawson's collapse at the reunion was no fleeting fainting spell, no stress-related scare he could laugh off later. The days that followed unraveled his illusion of invincibility. Tests revealed a rare cardiac condition, one that could not be fixed with quick surgery, one that required painstaking, specialized long-term management. For a man who thrived on control, on conquering obstacles with sheer will, the diagnosis was a humiliation in itself. His body had betrayed him, and worse, the world he had built around image and strength began to crumble. His girlfriend, unable to handle the burden of a partner who might never fully recover, quietly exited his life with a brittle excuse about needing someone who could keep up. Friends who had once filled his nights with noise and bravado grew distant, their calls less frequent, their invitations evaporating. Even colleagues, once eager to bask in his charisma, now tiptoed around him, unsure of how to treat a man no longer untouchable. Prideful as ever, Ethan responded by pushing everyone further away, his arrogance hardening into armor against pity. He insisted he didn't need help, that he could handle this alone. But the truth was evident. Ethan Lawson, for the first time, was profoundly alone. When the hospital assigned Rachel Carter to his case, the irony hit with a sharp cruelty neither of them could ignore. Now a nurse practitioner, Rachel had earned her reputation for steady hands and compassionate care, trusted by doctors and patients alike. But the moment she read Ethan's name on her assignment sheet, her stomach dropped. The man who had shattered her dignity at the reunion, the man who had reminded her, publicly, of her invisibility, was now dependent on her skill to manage his recovery. She considered asking for a reassignment, but protocol left her little room. Ethan's condition required someone with her specialization, and the hospital had made its decision. When she first entered his room, he looked at her with disbelief that quickly curdled into anger. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as though fate itself had betrayed him. "You?" He spat, the word heavy with resentment. Rachel held her ground, mask of professionalism hiding the sting. Inside, however, she warred with herself. Every fiber of her being wanted to walk out, to remind him that he had once declared she would never be wanted. But her oath, her duty, her identity as a healer rooted her in place. She wasn't here as the girl he rejected. She was here as the nurse who wouldn't let her patients down. From the beginning, their interactions burned with tension. Ethan, stripped of his usual power, lashed out at the one person who knew exactly how low he had fallen. His pride couldn't stomach the idea that Rachel, quiet, overlooked Rachel, was now the keeper of his health. He masked his shame with anger, snapping at her, challenging every instruction, refusing kindness as if it were poison. Rachel, meanwhile, forced herself to remain steady, answering his bitterness with measured calm. Yet every word he threw at her scraped against old wounds. She had spent years swallowing invisibility, convincing herself she was stronger than rejection, but now she was face to face with the man who had made her humiliation public. The proximity was unbearable, the long hours of monitoring, the routine of check-ins, the shared silences heavy with unspoken history. Still, professionalism demanded she stay. And in that fragile balance, something began to stir. For Rachel, this wasn't just about Ethan's health. It was about reclaiming her sense of self. For Ethan, it was about confronting the reality that the woman he dismissed as insignificant might be the very one holding his life together. Their dynamic was no longer simple. It was a collision of past wounds, of pride and compassion, of shame and resilience, setting the stage for a reckoning neither could avoid. Ethan made Rachel's job as difficult as possible in those first weeks. He resisted every adjustment to his treatment plan, questioned every instruction, and filled the sterile hospital room with barbed remarks aimed to wound. "You must enjoy this," he sneered once, when she adjusted his fore. "Finally having power over someone who never wanted you." The words stung, but Rachel had begun to change. Gone was the timid girl who once wilted under his dismissal. She met his bitterness with a calm steadiness that unnerved him. "This isn't about me, Ethan," she said evenly. "And it's not about you being in control. It's about your health. And if you can't see that, then you'll make your own recovery harder." Every time he tried to push her away, Rachel planted boundaries he couldn't shake. Her quiet firmness, her refusal to break under his cruelty, chipped at his arrogance. For the first time, Ethan felt the tables turn, not because she sought revenge, but because she refused to diminish herself anymore. The more he fought, the more she revealed that she was no longer the shadow of his past. She was her own force. Rachel's private battles deepened the strain. At home, her family worried about her entanglement with Ethan. Her mother, practical and sharp-tongued, urged her to focus on career stability. "Residency nearly broke you, Rachel. Don't let some man, especially him, derail everything you've worked for." Even her siblings echoed the concern, reminding her that Ethan had humiliated her once, that he wasn't worth the emotional cost. Rachel carried their voices like weights, torn between the duty she owed her patient and the wound he had left in her. Meanwhile, Ethan's past came crashing into his hospital room in the form of his estranged father. Cold, commanding, and critical, the older Lawson wasted no time in tearing into his son. He called Ethan reckless, a failure for letting his health collapse, a disappointment for becoming dependent. Rachel watched the exchange with a tightening chest. Ethan, usually so sharp-tongued, shrank beneath his father's disapproval, his bravado collapsing into silence. It was the first time she saw not just arrogance, but pain, the kind born of years of never being good enough. When Rachel finally stepped between them, defending Ethan with a quiet, unshakable authority, something shifted. "He's not a failure," she told the elder Lawson firmly. "He's sick, and he needs support, not condemnation. If you can't give him that, then leave." Her voice, steady but cutting, filled the room with a strength Ethan had never expected from her. His father faltered, glared, and left without another word. The silence afterward was thick, broken only by the sound of Ethan's uneven breathing. He didn't thank her, not right away, but something in his expression had changed, a flicker of doubt in his own arrogance, a recognition that perhaps Rachel Carter was no longer the girl he could dismiss. Yet Rachel herself wrestled with the weight of the moment. For days she considered transferring his case, convincing herself it would be easier to avoid the tangle of history and resentment. But when she held the paperwork in her hands, something inside her resisted. Walking away would mean surrendering, to him, to her family's doubts, to the narrative that she was always the one who backed down. No, she thought. This time she would stay. Not to win Ethan's approval, not to rewrite their past, but to prove, to herself most of all, that she was stronger than he ever allowed her to be. The tension between them had been simmering for weeks, every conversation laced with unspoken resentment and old scars. One evening, as Rachel adjusted his monitor after another grueling day, Ethan's pride finally exploded. "You think I don't see it?" he snapped, his voice jagged with bitterness. "You're only here because it makes you feel superior. The invisible girl finally has power over me, and you love it." His words cut like glass, sharper because Rachel knew he believed them. For a moment she froze, her hands trembling above the machine, but then something inside her snapped. She turned to him, eyes blazing with a fury he had never seen. "Superior?" she hissed. "You arrogant fool. I once loved you, Ethan. Do you hear me? Loved you. But that was before you humiliated me, before you proved that all you care about is control. Now, when I look at you, all I feel is pity. Pity for the broken man who's so terrified of being vulnerable that he'd rather destroy everyone around him than admit he needs help." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's bravado crumbled. Her words had struck deeper than he wanted to admit. For the first time, his arrogance faltered, leaving only the raw, exposed truth of a man who had built his life on fragile pride. The argument still echoed in the air when it happened. Alarms shrieked, monitors spiked, and Ethan's body convulsed with a sudden cardiac crisis. His face blanched, lips turning blue, and his breath caught in a terrifying silence that hollowed the room. Rachel's training took over in an instant. Her anger, her pain, her history with him vanished as pure instinct surged forward. She called for assistance, but she knew she was the only one close enough, fast enough to act. Her hands pressed firmly against his chest, her voice urgent as she counted compressions, praying each movement would be enough. Sweat beaded on her forehead as minutes stretched like hours. She refused to lose him, not like this, not with her last words to him ringing with venom. When the monitor finally steadied, when the shallow rise of his chest returned, Rachel nearly collapsed with relief. Ethan, pale and trembling, opened his eyes just enough to see her. In that moment of raw weakness, stripped of his defenses, his voice cracked with a truth he could no longer hide. "I don't want to die alone," he whispered hoarsely. "And you're the only one who stayed." The weight of those words, fragile and desperate, pressed heavier than any insult he had ever thrown. Later, when the emergency team had stabilized him and the chaos subsided, Ethan lay silent, staring at the ceiling with an expression Rachel had never seen before, one not of arrogance, but of surrender. She sat at his bedside, exhausted, still shaken by how close he had come to the edge. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and halting. "Do you know why I fought you? Why I pushed so hard?" His eyes glistened, not with anger, but with something dangerously close to vulnerability. "Because needing you meant admitting you mattered. And if you mattered, then I couldn't pretend I was untouchable anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with the kind of honesty he had never allowed himself to speak. Rachel felt her chest tighten, torn between the ache of what he'd done to her and the truth of the man unraveling before her. She didn't answer immediately, not because she had nothing to say, but because she finally understood. This was not the Ethan who had mocked her at the reunion. This was a man broken open, admitting that the one person he had dismissed was, in the end, the only one he truly needed. For the first time, the power between them shifted, not because Rachel had sought revenge, but because Ethan had finally seen her eye in the weeks that followed Ethan's emergency. Rachel found herself standing at a crossroads, one she realized wasn't about him at all, but about herself. For years, she had defined her worth by how others perceived her, the dependable daughter, the loyal friend, the quiet shadow in Ethan's orbit. But saving his life had forced her to confront the truth. She had power, not because of him, but because of who she was. She threw herself into her career with renewed focus, mapping out a future that belonged solely to her. She applied for advanced fellowships, set professional boundaries she once feared to enforce, and discovered that confidence wasn't about being loud, but about refusing to diminish herself. At home, she began mending the fragile distance with her mother. Their conversations, once sharp and critical, softened into honest exchanges. Rachel admitted how invisible she had always felt, and her mother, surprisingly, listened, even apologized. That honesty rebuilt something between them, A recognition that Rachel was no longer just the reliable one, but a woman who demanded to be seen on her own terms. For the first time in her life, Rachel wasn't waiting for someone else to notice her. She noticed herself. Meanwhile, Ethan's recovery forced him to dismantle the armor he had carried for so long. He was no longer the man striding into boardrooms with effortless bravado. He was a patient relearning how to live with limitations. For someone who had always equated worth with dominance, humility came painfully, but it came nonetheless. He found himself reflecting on the choices that had left him isolated, the careless arrogance, the hollow victories, the people he had driven away. Most of all, he replayed his moments with Rachel, the rejection, the insults, the cruelty born of fear, and realized how deeply he had wounded the one person who had stood by him when everyone else left. One afternoon, with trembling sincerity, he apologized. No charm, no excuses, just truth. He acknowledged every word that had cut her, admitted that he had dismissed her not because she was invisible, but because she terrified him. "You were always stronger than me, Rachel," he confessed, voice raw. "And I was too proud to see it." For Ethan, those words were harder than any courtroom battle. They weren't about winning. They were about surrendering the ego that had nearly destroyed him. Rachel listened, and though her heart softened, she didn't fall back into old patterns. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't mean erasing the past. It meant choosing how the past would shape the future. She told Ethan plainly that she forgave him, but forgiveness did not equal submission. She would not be someone's backup plan, not the invisible neighbor girl waiting to be chosen. If he wanted her in his life, it had to be as an equal partner, nothing less. Ethan, humbled and stripped of pretense, nodded with a sincerity that made her believe he understood. For the first time, their dynamic was not built on imbalance, not her yearning or his arrogance, but on honesty. Whether their future together would take root remained uncertain, but Rachel no longer needed that certainty to feel whole. She had grown beyond it. The empowerment wasn't in winning Ethan's love, it was in claiming her own. And as she walked out of the hospital one evening, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead of her, Rachel smiled. Not because she had been seen at last, but because she had learned to see herself. Months later, the world around Rachel looked different, not because the city had changed, but because she had. Her hands, once bound by duty, now shaped canvases filled with colors she had been too afraid to claim. The night of her first art show and fundraiser, the gallery hummed with laughter, champagne glasses clinking, and the shuffle of curious patrons stopping to admire her work. Rachel stood at the center of it all, radiant yet grounded, introducing her pieces not as a nurse hiding behind practicality, but as an artist who finally allowed herself to be seen. This was her dream made tangible. Her voice stretched across paint and canvas, and she owned every inch of the room. Then, almost quietly, she noticed him. Ethan, standing at the back, not in his tailored armor of expensive suits, but in something simple, unassuming. He wasn't commanding attention, wasn't performing for a crowd. Instead, he blended into the background, clapping when others clapped, listening when Rachel spoke. For once, he wasn't the storm in the room. He was the anchor, letting her brilliance take center stage. His presence was both a surprise and a statement. He wasn't there to claim her. He was there to support her. As the evening unfolded, Rachel found herself sneaking glances at him, not out of longing, but out of wonder. This was a different Ethan, not the man who had once towered over her with arrogance, but someone quieter, smaller in ego, larger in heart. When a guest asked about her inspiration, Ethan didn't interrupt or insert himself. He listened with the rest, pride flickering only in his eyes. It struck Rachel that this was the proof she hadn't known she needed. He had changed, not for show, not to win her back, but because he had finally learned to value her. The woman he once dismissed, the strength he once mocked, the dream he once overlooked. Standing by her art, she realized she no longer lived in his shadow, nor in the ache of his rejection. She was whole on her own, and his presence was simply an acknowledgement of that wholeness. When their eyes finally met across the room, it wasn't a look of longing or apology, but recognition. They had both walked through fire, and neither had come out the same. Later that evening, after the crowd thinned and Rachel stepped outside into the cool night air, Ethan approached. He didn't try to sweep her off her feet, didn't come armed with grand speeches. Instead, he leaned in just enough for her to hear and whispered, "The truth is, I've always needed you. I just wasn't man enough to admit it." His voice carried no bravado, only vulnerability, as if the words had been waiting for years to be freed. Rachel's heart softened, but not in the way it once would have. She smiled, not because his confession validated her worth, but because she no longer needed validation at all. He wasn't her completion. He was simply someone who had finally learned to see her. In that moment, she felt both the weight of their history and the freedom of their future, whatever shape it might take. Empowerment, redemption, and closure weren't found in rekindling the past, but in standing side by side as equals, with no illusions left between them. As she walked back inside, her steps were steady, her smile real. For the first time, Rachel wasn't the forgotten girl in the background of someone else's story. She was the author of her own.